What happens when arrogance at 35,000 feet collides with a lifetime of expertise? We've all heard stories of unruly passengers, but this one is different. This is the story of a man, a successful, powerful man who looked at his pilot and saw only the color of his skin. He made a demand born from pure prejudice, a demand that would set in motion a chain of events so terrifying and so perfectly karmic, it would lead to the complete and utter unraveling of his life. Stay with us as we recount the chilling story of American Airlines Flight 100, a racist ultimatum, a mid-air emergency, and the day Arthur Jensen learned that who is in the cockpit matters far more than he could ever have imagined. He made a single fateful decision before takeoff and would spend the rest of his life regretting it. The atmosphere at Gate 47 of New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport was a familiar symphony of controlled chaos. It was a crisp Tuesday evening, and the passengers of American Airlines Flight 100 to London Heathrow were a mix of weary business travelers, excited tourists, and families heading home. The digital screen glowed with the promise of an on-time departure. Among the sea of faces, one stood out not for its expression, but for the aura of imposing self-importance that surrounded it. Arthur Jensen was a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. At 58, he was the CEO of Jensen Capital, a private equity firm known for its ruthless yet undeniably successful acquisition strategies. His suit was a tailored Zegna, his watch a Patek Philippe, and his shoes gleamed with a polish that seemed to repel the scuffs and dirt of the common world. He was flying to London to close a 9-figure deal that would be the capstone of his career. For Arthur Jensen, the world was a hierarchy, and he was firmly, unassailably, at the top. He clutched his leather briefcase, his gaze sweeping over the other passengers with a detached disdain. He saw mediocrity, a herd waiting to be corralled onto the aluminum tube that would ferry them across the Atlantic. His first-class ticket was his shield, a guarantee that he would be osculated from the masses. As the pre-boarding announcement for first class began, a figure emerged from the jet bridge, walking toward the gate agent's podium. He was a tall, distinguished man in a crisp pilot's uniform. His posture was impeccable, radiating a calm authority. The 4 gold stripes on his epaulettes denoted his rank captain. He had a warm, reassuring smile as he spoke briefly with the ground crew, his voice a low, steady baritone. His name tag read, M. Vance. Captain Marcus Vance was a 25-year veteran of the skies, a former Air Force pilot who had flown C-17s in combat zones before transitioning to commercial aviation. He was one of America's most respected and experienced pilots, with a flawless record. He was also a black man. Arthur Jensen watched him, and a subtle sneer tightened the corners of his mouth. He wasn't overtly racist in his corporate life. It was bad for business. But in the private chambers of his mind, prejudice was a deeply ingrained operating system. He saw a black man in a position of ultimate authority, and to him, the image was incongruous, like a poorly cast actor in a role he didn't deserve. He associated pilots with the stoic, square-jawed white men he'd seen in movies and airline ads his entire life. This to him felt like a diversity hire, a token, not a commander. When the boarding call was made, Jensen was the first to the podium. He handed his ticket to the agent without making eye contact, then strode down the jet bridge. As he was about to step onto the aircraft, Captain Vance was standing just inside the galley, personally greeting the first-class passengers, a personal touch he was known for. "Welcome aboard," Sir Captain Vance said, his smile genuine. Arthur Jensen stopped dead. He looked from Vance's smiling face down to the 4 stripes on his shoulders, and then back up. The disdain was no longer hidden. It was raw and unconcealed. He didn't reply. He simply stared for a moment, a look of profound disbelief on his face before pushing past him without a word and turning left toward his seat. A. The lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Sarah Jenkins, noticed the exchange. She saw the flash of contempt in Jensen's eyes and the brief, almost imperceptible flicker of practiced patience in her captain's. She'd been flying for 15 years and had developed a 6th sense for trouble. A small, cold knot formed in her stomach. This wasn't going to be a smooth flight, and they hadn't even closed the doors yet. Jensen settled into his spacious pod, accepting a glass of champagne from another attendant. He took a sip, but the expensive bubbly tasted sour. His mind was racing. He was entrusting his life, his multi-million-dollar deal to that man. He replayed the image in his head, the pilot's black face, his calm demeanor. Jensen's internal monologue was venomous. He felt it was a risk, an unacceptable deviation from the norm. His prejudice, long simmering beneath a veneer of corporate civility, was about to boil over. He looked out the window at the ground crew, then back toward the cockpit door. He made a decision. It was a decision rooted in nothing but bigotry, and it was a decision that would seal his fate. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Sarah Jenkins was in the middle of her pre-flight safety checks when Arthur Jensen appeared in the galley, his face a mask of indignation. He held his half-empty champagne flute like a weapon. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but sharp, dripping with condescension. "I need to speak with someone in charge." Sarah turned, maintaining her professional smile, the one that had diffused countless minor passenger complaints over the years. "I'm Sarah, the lead purser for this flight. How can I help you, Mr. Jensen?" "You can start by telling me who the actual pilot of this aircraft is," he demanded. Sarah's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened slightly. "You've already met him, sir. Captain Marcus Vance is commanding our flight to London tonight. You're in the best hands in the fleet." Jensen let out a short, derisive laugh. No. I think there's been a mistake. I saw the man at the door. I will not be flown across the Atlantic Ocean by him. I demand a different pilot." The statement hung in the air, thick and toxic. 2 other flight attendants who were preparing the cabin froze their eyes wide. This wasn't a complaint about a broken TV screen or a misplaced meal order. This was something else entirely. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath, her training kicking in. "De-escalate. Remain calm. Sir, I can assure you Captain Vance is a highly experienced and decorated pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. There is no other pilot for this flight. Could you please return to your seat? We're preparing for departure. Are you not listening to me?" Jensen's voice rose, attracting the attention of other passengers in the first and business class cabins. "I am a paying customer, a first-class customer, and I am not comfortable with the personnel in that cockpit. I find his appointment to be a matter of concern for the safety of this aircraft." He used the word personnel and appointment as if Vance were a janitor who'd wandered into the wrong room. The racist implication was no longer veiled. It was stark and ugly. "Sir, your concern is based on what exactly." Sarah's tone was still professional, but the politeness was now a thin sheet of ice over a core of steel. "It is based on my prerogative as a customer not to be part of some social experiment at 35,000 feet. Jensen spat. "I want a white pilot. I'm sure you have one. Find him." The demand, so blunt and vile, silenced the cabin. The soft hum of the ventilation system seemed to roar in the sudden quiet. A passenger in seat 2B, a man named Robert Peterson, shook his head in disgust. "For God's sake, man, it's 2025. Sit down and shut up." Jensen whirled around. "You mind your own business. This concerns my safety." At that moment, the cockpit door opened. Captain Vance had been alerted by the junior flight attendant about the disturbance. He stepped into the galley, his presence immediately commanding the space. He looked at Jensen, his expression unreadable, his first officer. A young, eager pilot named David Miller stood just behind him in the doorway, looking horrified. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Jensen?" Captain Vance's voice was even devoid of the anger he had every right to feel. Seeing Vance face to face only emboldened Jensen. He felt this was his moment to assert his dominance. "There is, in fact. I'm not confident in your ability to command this aircraft. I've made it clear to your staff that I require a different pilot for this journey." Captain Vance didn't rise to the bait. He didn't defend his record or list his credentials. He simply looked at Jensen with a piercing, analytical gaze, as if studying a malfunctioning instrument. Sir Vance said calmly, "The only person questioning my ability to command this aircraft is you. Not the FA, not the United States Air Force, and not American Airlines. Every other soul on this plane has placed their trust in me and my crew. The issue here is not in this cockpit. It's in your seat." He then turned to Sarah. "Is the passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions?" "Yes, Captain," Sarah said, her voice firm. "He is refusing to take his seat for departure." Vance nodded slowly, his eyes locking back onto Jensen. "Mr. Jensen, you have two choices. You can return to seat 1A. Fasten your seatbelt and allow us to depart for London on schedule. Or you can deplane. We can have your luggage removed. The decision is yours, but you have to make it right now. We have a schedule to keep." The finality in Vance's voice was absolute. There was no negotiation. Jensen was stunned. He was used to managers fawning over him of his complaints being met with apologies and upgrades. He was being spoken to as if he were a common thug. He looked around expecting support, but was met only with faces of contempt and disgust from his fellow passengers. His London deal flashed in his mind. Missing this flight was not an option. The contracts had to be signed in person tomorrow morning. Humiliation and fury warred within him. He felt his power, his status slipping away. In a final pathetic attempt to save face, he sneered. "Fine," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll stay. But if anything goes wrong on this flight, I will hold you personally responsible. I'll own this airline." He turned on his heel and stomped back to his seat, slamming his body into the plush leather. He violently buckled his seatbelt and glared out the window, refusing to look at anyone. Captain Vance gave a curt nod to Sarah, who mouthed, "I'm sorry." He simply nodded again, a flicker of weariness in his eyes, before retreating back into the sterile sanctuary of the cockpit. As the door clicked shut, the finality of the sound echoed through the cabin. The flight was proceeding, but the journey had been poisoned before it had even begun. For Arthur Jensen, the battle was over, and he had, in his twisted view, won by staying on the plane. For everyone else, the real ordeal was just beginning. With the cockpit door sealed, the professional rhythm of the pre-flight checklist resumed. First Officer David Miller, still shaken, turned to his captain. "I can't believe that just happened, Marcus. Are you okay?" Captain Vance didn't look up from the instrument panel. His hands moved with a familiar, practiced grace over the switches and dials. "I'm fine, Dave. Just run the checklist." His voice was flat, a carefully constructed wall to hide the sting of the encounter. He had faced racism before, subtler couched in corporate jargon or dismissive glances. But the raw, unfiltered bigotry from Jensen was a different beast. It was a throwback to a darker time, a venomous spit in the face of everything he had achieved. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not here. The cockpit was a place of sterile procedure and absolute focus. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Engine bleeds," Miller prompted, forcing himself back into the routine. "Set and checked," Vance responded, his eyes scanning the overhead panel. They worked in silence for a few moments, the call and response of the checklist a comforting liturgy in the small space. But the tension was undeniable. Miller kept glancing at Vance, seeing the tightness in his jaw. "The man's a disgrace," Miller finally said, unable to hold it in. "They should have thrown him off the plane. We could have cited him for interfering with a flight crew. And delayed the flight by another 2 hours while we filed reports and had the Port Authority drag him off." Vance counted his gaze, fixed on the taxiway ahead, as the plane began its slow pushback from the gate. It would have punished 200 other people for the ignorance of one. He made his choice. Now we do our job. Let's leave it at that. His words were final, but the sentiment wasn't so easily dismissed. The incident had cast a pall over the entire crew. In the cabin, Sarah and her team moved with a strained, brittle efficiency. The other first-class passengers pointedly ignored Arthur Jensen, who sat stewing in his seat, radiating a palpable aura of animosity. He had his noise-cancelling headphones on, his eyes closed, but he wasn't listening to music. He was replaying the confrontation, fanning the flames of his own indignation. He felt wronged, his authority challenged. He was Arthur Jensen. People didn't talk to him that way. He promised himself he would write a letter to the CEO of the airline that would see Captain Vance and that smug flight attendant fired. As AA-100 taxied to the runway, the lights of JFK glittered in the encroaching darkness. The plane paused, holding short a powerful machine, waiting for its command. In the cockpit, Vance's hands rested lightly on the thrust levers. AA-100 winds, 290, at 10 runway 31L, cleared for takeoff. The tower controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Cleared for takeoff runway 31L, American 100. Vance confirmed his voice, the epitome of professional calm. He nudged the thrust levers forward. The two massive General Electric engines spooled up their deep rumble, vibrating through the fuselage. The aircraft surged forward, pressing everyone back into their seats. For Jensen, the raw power was a momentary thrill, a familiar feeling of control. He watched the runway markers blur into white streaks. "V1," Miller called out. "The decision speed, the point of no return." "Rotate," Vance commanded, pulling back gently on the yoke. The nose of the 707 lifted gracefully, and seconds later the main landing gear left the tarmac. They were airborne, climbing steeply into the night sky over Queens. For most passengers, it was a moment of magic and relief. For Arthur Jensen, it was a moment of vindication. He had won. He was on his way to London. He smirked, looking down at the shrinking city below. The pilot in his mind was now just a chauffeur, an employee. As the plane ascended through 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign pinged off. The cabin lights brightened, and the attendants began their service. Jensen ordered a double Scotch neat. When Sarah brought it to him, her expression was neutral, her service impeccable. This infuriated him even more than an argument would have. He felt her politeness was a form of insolence. "Make sure you keep them coming," he said, snatching the glass from her tray. "It's going to be a long flight with this amateur hour in the cockpit." Sarah simply smiled a tight, professional smile. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Jensen." As she walked away, he muttered just loud enough for the passenger behind him to hear, "Let's just hope he knows how to use the autopilot." The flight continued east, a silver needle stitching its way across the black fabric of the night. Over the coast of Newfoundland, they entered oceanic airspace, leaving the reassuring web of ground-based radar behind. They were a tiny, self-contained world, soaring through the void, utterly dependent on the machinery around them and the skill of the two people at the controls. Up in the cockpit, the tension had eased into a routine vigilance. Vance and Miller monitored the systems, the weather radar showing clear skies ahead. The North Atlantic was a vast, dark mirror below them. "Looks like a smooth crossing tonight," Miller remarked, sipping his coffee. "Let's hope so," Vance replied, his gaze sweeping the instruments. "The smoother the better." But the sky is a fickle beast. An hour later, about 400 miles east of Gander, a small amber light flickered on the EICAS engine indicating and crew alerting system display. It was a caution message. ENG1, oil filter. It was a minor alert. It meant the primary oil filter for the left engine was getting clogged and the oil was now using a bypass. It wasn't an emergency, not even close. 99 times out of 100, it was a faulty sensor or a minor issue that would be dealt with by maintenance on the ground in London. Vance acknowledged the message. "Noted. Let's keep a close eye on the #1 engine temps and oil pressure. Probably a sensor issue, but let's be thorough." They followed procedure cross-checking all related engine parameters. Everything was normal. Oil pressure was stable, temperature was green. But the light stayed on a tiny, persistent amber star, glowing in the darkness of the cockpit. It was the first note in a symphony that was about to go terrifyingly wrong. Arthur Jensen, 4 scotches into his flight, was blissfully unaware that the man he had dismissed as a social experiment was now watching over his life with the heightened focus of a surgeon. For the next 30 minutes, the flight continued smoothly. In the cabin, dinner service was concluding. Arthur Jensen had finished his steak and was on his 5th scotch. The alcohol had dulled his rage into a sullen, simmering arrogance. He felt powerful, insulated by altitude and alcohol. He had just sent a scathing email to his assistant, instructing her to draft a formal complaint to American Airlines corporate office detailing the unprofessional and insolent behavior of Captain Vance and purser Sarah Jenkins. He was already imagining the groveling apology he would receive. In the cockpit, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The amber light for the oil filter was still glowing, and now a second more concerning reading had appeared. The oil temperature on the left engine, engine 1, had begun to creep up. It was a slow, almost imperceptible rise, but it was steady. 1 degree, then another. It was still within normal operating limits, but the trend was undeniable. "Okay, I don't like this," Vance said, his voice level, but with a new edge of concern. "The filter message I can live with. The rising temp I cannot. It suggests there's a real issue. We might have an oil leak." First Officer Miller was already pulling up the relevant electronic checklist on his display. "Agreed. Pressure is still holding steady, though." "For now," Vance added grimly. "But if we lose too much oil, that pressure will drop off a cliff, and then the engine will seize. I'd rather not be in that position over the middle of the Atlantic at night." As if on cue, a sudden violent jolt shook the entire aircraft. It wasn't the gentle rocking of normal turbulence. It was a hard, percussive bang, as if the plane had been struck by a giant fist. In the cabin, gasps and screams erupted. Jensen's glass of scotch flew from his hand, splashing across his expensive suit. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, grabbing his armrests. Up front, a cacophony of alarms blared to life. A bright red warning flashed on the main display, ENG-1 stall. It was accompanied by a deep, shuddering vibration that ran through the entire airframe. The left engine had just suffered a compressor stall, a violent disruption of the airflow that could tear an engine apart if not handled immediately. Vance's hands moved with an instinct born of thousands of hours of training. His left hand pulled the engine 1 thrust lever back to idle, while his right hand kept the aircraft steady. His feet danced on the rudder pedals, compensating for the sudden loss of thrust on the left side. "Engine 1 stall checklist," he commanded, his voice cutting through the alarms. Miller, though his heart was pounding, responded instantly, his fingers flying across the touch screen. "Checklist is up. Thrust lever 1. Confirmed idle," Vance said. The plane shuddered again, less violently this time. The alarms fell silent as the engine stabilized, but the damage was done. The vibration, though reduced, was still there, a deep, unhealthy grinding noise that could be felt through the floor. Worse, the engine temperature, which had been creeping up, was now rocketing toward the red line, and the oil pressure gauge began to fall. The needle was visibly dropping. "There it is," Vance said, his voice grim. "We're losing the oil. The engine is tearing itself apart. We need to shut it down." This was the moment every pilot trains for, but hopes to never experience a critical engine failure over a dark ocean hundreds of miles from the nearest runway. There was no fear in Vance's voice, only focused analytical command. He keyed the microphone for the cabin. His voice, broadcast through the speakers, was a beacon of impossible calm in the rising sea of panic. "Folks, this is Captain Vance from the cockpit. We appear to have had an issue with our number 1 engine. We are handling the situation, and the aircraft is under our complete control. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts securely fastened. We will update you shortly." The passengers, terrified by the violent bang and shuddering, were momentarily reassured by his tone. But Arthur Jensen was not. All he heard was confirmation of his worst fears. An issue with the engine, he thought. The amateur had broken the plane. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his drunken haze. He was trapped in a metal tube miles above a freezing ocean, and the man he had just tried to have removed from the flight was his only hope. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid. In the cockpit, the situation was stark. "Declare an emergency," Vance ordered. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Tell Gander we have an engine failure and fire warning. We are shutting down engine 1 and diverting immediately." As Miller made the call, Vance initiated the engine shutdown procedure. He lifted the protective cover over the fuel control switch for engine 1. "Confirming engine 1 fuel control switch," he said. "Confirmed," Miller replied, his eyes locked on the procedure. Vance moved the switch to cut off. The grinding noise subsided, replaced by the eerie sound of the massive fan windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The 707 was now flying on a single engine. "Engine 1 fire handle," Vance commanded. "Confirmed." Vance pulled the red handle. It cut off all fuel, hydraulic, and electrical lines to the dead engine and armed the fire extinguishers. A moment later, the fire warning light, which had illuminated as the engine's core temperature soared, went out. "Fire is out," Miller said, a wave of relief in his voice. They had stabilized the aircraft. The immediate danger was over. But they were still in the middle of the night over the North Atlantic, with only one good engine. Their new destination was Gander, Newfoundland. Over an hour away, Vance took a deep breath and keyed the mic for the cabin again. "Folks, Captain Vance again. We have successfully shut down the affected engine. The aircraft is designed to fly perfectly safely on one engine, and we are now diverting to Gander International Airport in Newfoundland. The flight attendants will be coming through the cabin to prepare for landing. We expect to be on the ground in about 75 minutes. Please remain calm and follow their instructions." In seat 1A, Arthur Jensen sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. The calm, authoritative voice coming over the speakers belonged to the man he had scorned. Every reassuring word was a dagger of shame. He was utterly, completely powerless. His money meant nothing. His status meant nothing. His entire life was now dependent on the skill and professionalism of a man he had judged solely on the color of his skin. The fury of the Atlantic seemed to have manifested inside his own gut, churning with a nauseating mix of terror and regret. The 75-minute flight to Gander was the longest of Arthur Jensen's life. The normal, placid atmosphere of a transatlantic flight had been shattered. In its place was a tense, anxious silence, punctuated only by the calm, methodical instructions of the flight attendants moving through the cabin. They secured galleys, briefed passengers in exit rows, and offered quiet words of reassurance, their professionalism a stark contrast to the fear that was palpable in the air. Jensen sat rigid in his seat. The effects of the alcohol had vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of mortal fear. The asymmetric thrust from the single operating engine gave the plane a slightly skewed feeling, a constant subtle reminder of their crippled state. He could hear the lone engine on the right side of the plane, its hum now sounding both heroic and strained. Every minor bump of turbulence sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He looked around at the other passengers. He saw fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, trust. They were listening to the crew following their instructions without question. They had placed their faith in the calm voice from the cockpit. Jensen, who had placed his faith only in himself and his own prejudices, felt a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. His mind, a finely tuned instrument for hostile takeovers and market analysis, was now replaying his own behavior at the gate with excruciating detail. He heard his own words dripping with arrogance and racism. "I demand a different pilot. I'm not confident in your ability." The memory burned with a shame so intense it made him physically sick. What would Captain Vance be thinking right now? Would he be thinking about the vile passenger in 1A? Would the distraction compromise his focus? The thought that his own bigotry could be a factor in his survival was a new and horrifying dimension to his regret. Up in the cockpit, Arthur Jensen was the furthest thing from Captain Vance's mind. He and First Officer Miller were a study in focused intensity. They had completed the emergency checklists and were now meticulously planning their approach and landing into Gander. Gander weather is reporting winds 260 at 15 knots, gusting to 25. Some light rain. Miller reported reading the information sent to them via data link. It'll be a crosswind landing. On a wet runway with one engine. Fun, Vance remarked dryly, but without a hint of stress. He had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times in the simulator. "We'll use a flaps 20 landing. It'll give us a higher approach speed, but better control authority. Inform the cabin. It's going to be a firm landing. Tell them to expect it." He was in his element. The crisis hadn't unnerved him. It had sharpened him. All the years of training the discipline forged in the military, the thousands of hours of quiet vigilance in the sky, it all converged into this single point. This was why he had 4 stripes on his shoulders. He wasn't just a pilot. He was the commander of a small airborne city, and he was bringing his people home. As they began their descent, the coastline of Newfoundland appeared on the navigation display, a welcome sight after the black void of the ocean. Vance hand flew the aircraft his inputs on the controls, smooth and precise. He didn't want the autopilot. He wanted to feel the plane, to be connected to it in these critical final moments. He made one last announcement to the cabin. "Folks, we are now on our final approach into Gander. The airport emergency services will be on the runway to meet us as a standard precaution. Please ensure you are in a braced position until the aircraft comes to a complete stop at the gate. Thank you for your cooperation." The phrase, emergency services, sent a fresh wave of fear through the cabin. Jensen braced himself, pushing his feet flat against the floor and pressing his head back into the seat. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since he was a child, he prayed. He didn't pray to be saved. He prayed for the pilot. He prayed for the man he had insulted, to have the skill, the strength, the focus to do what needed to be done. Through the cockpit window, the runway lights of Gander sliced through the rainy darkness. The crosswind was strong, trying to push the nose of the plane to the right. Vance compensated with rudder and a slight wing-down correction, a delicate balancing act in a 200-ton machine. 500 feet, Miller called out, monitoring the instruments. "Stable," Vance confirmed. 100, 50, 30, 20. With a final masterful maneuver, Vance kicked the rudder to align the plane with the center line, just as the main gear touched down. As he'd warned, the landing was firm, but it was perfect. The wheels hit the tarmac with a reassuring screech. He deployed the thrust reverser on the single good engine and applied the brakes, bringing the massive jet to a controlled, steady stop. On the runway, an army of fire trucks and emergency vehicles, lights flashing, flanked the plane. They had made it. They were safe. A sound started in the back of the cabin. It was a single person clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire aircraft erupted in a thunderous wave of applause and relieved cheers. People were crying, hugging strangers in the adjacent seats. It was a raw, emotional release of pent-up terror. Arthur Jensen did not clap. He couldn't. He sat completely still, tears streaming down his face. They weren't tears of relief, but of profound, soul-crushing shame. The applause was for the man he had deemed unworthy. The hero of the hour was the man whose authority he had tried to deny. The landing hadn't just brought him back to solid ground, it had brought him crashing down from the pedestal of his own arrogance. He had never felt so small, so utterly and completely wrong. As the 777 taxied toward the terminal, guided by the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, the cabin remained abuzz with relieved chatter. The passengers who had been strangers just hours ago were now bound by a shared trauma and a collective sense of gratitude. They craned their necks to look out the windows at the fire trucks, a stark reminder of the danger they had just passed through. When the aircraft finally came to a stop at the gate and the lone engine spooled down into silence, Captain Vance made his final announcement. "Folks, on behalf of the entire crew, welcome to Gander, Newfoundland. I know this was not our intended destination, but I'm glad we could all get here safely. Airline representatives will meet you at the gate to assist with accommodation and rebooking. Thank you again for your calm and cooperation." The moment the seatbelt sign switched off, there was a collective sigh of relief. But no one moved to get their bags. Instead, a strange and unspoken consensus seemed to take hold. They waited. The cockpit door opened, and First Officer David Miller emerged first. He looked tired, but relieved. He was met with another round of applause. Then Captain Marcus Vance stepped out. The cabin fell silent. Every passenger turned to look at him. He stood for a moment in the galley, his uniform still immaculate, his face weary, but etched with a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had done his job. He had brought them all back safely. The man from seat 2B, Robert Peterson, who had defended Vance at the gate, stood up. "Captain," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you. On behalf of everyone on this flight, thank you for saving our lives." The cabin erupted in applause again, this time louder, more heartfelt. It was a standing ovation. Captain Vance simply nodded, a humble, grateful smile touching his lips. "It was a team effort," he said, gesturing to Sarah and the rest of the flight crew, who were also being thanked profusely by the passengers around them. "We're just glad everyone is safe." Arthur Jensen watched this scene unfold from his seat in 1A. He felt invisible, a ghost at a celebration he had no right to attend. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the upholstery of his seat. He knew he should say something, an apology, a thank you. The words were there, lodged in his throat, but they were trapped behind a lifetime of pride and a mountain of fresh shame. Passengers began to deplane, many of them stopping to shake Captain Vance's hand, to clap him on the shoulder to offer a personal word of thanks. He met each one with grace and humility. Jensen waited until the first-class cabin was almost empty. He knew he couldn't hide forever. He slowly stood up, grabbing his expensive leather briefcase, which now felt ridiculously heavy. He had to walk past the galley to exit the plane. He had to walk past Vance. As he approached, Captain Vance was speaking with Sarah. He saw Jensen coming and their conversation paused. The air grew thick with unspoken history. The other passengers were gone. It was just Jensen, the captain, and the crew. Jensen stopped. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the floor, then finally forced himself to meet Captain Vance's eyes. Vance's expression was not one of anger or triumph. It was neutral, professional. He was simply a captain looking at one of his passengers. This more than anything broke through Jensen's final wall of pride. He wasn't being judged. He was just being seen. Jensen began, his voice a hoarse croak. "I was wrong. What I said back at JFK. There's no excuse. You are an incredible pilot. You saved us. You saved me, and I am sorry." The apology was clumsy, inadequate, a pathetic offering against the magnitude of his offense and the scale of Vance's heroism. Captain Vance listened, his expression unchanging. He let the words hang in the air for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Apology accepted, Mr. Jensen," he said, his voice even. "Your opinion of me and my abilities was irrelevant at the gate, and it's irrelevant now. My only job was to ensure the safety of every passenger on this aircraft. That included you. Now the ground staff is waiting to assist you." It was a dismissal, a professional, courteous, and utterly devastating dismissal. Vance wasn't gloating. He wasn't rubbing it in. He was simply stating a fact. Arthur Jensen, CEO of Jensen Capital, a man who moved markets and shattered companies, did not matter. His prejudice, his power, his wealth, none of it had any currency in the face of genuine skill and responsibility. Jensen felt the blood drain from his face. He had offered the most humbling apology of his life, and had been met not with forgiveness, but with a calm indifference that was far more cutting. He had been relegated to what he was, just another passenger. He mumbled a thank you and stumbled off the plane down the jet bridge and into the small, quiet terminal of Gander International Airport. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He didn't know it yet, but his walk of shame was only just beginning. One of the passengers in business class, a young tech blogger named Chloe Martinez, had filmed his initial tirade at the gate on her phone. During the tense flight, she had edited the clip and upon landing and getting a signal, had uploaded it to social media with the caption, "Racist passenger demands a new pilot on AA100. He just got a lesson in what a real hero looks like." Captain Vance, American Airlines, flying while black. The video was already starting to go viral. The karma, which had begun at 35,000 feet, was about to follow him down to the ground and shatter his entire world. By the time Arthur Jensen was checked into his complimentary room at the Gander Airport Hotel, a bland space with beige walls and a view of the rain-slicked tarmac, his world was already burning down, and he was the last to know. He was operating on pure, self-serving adrenaline, still the protagonist in his own distorted narrative. He saw the emergency landing not as a moment of salvation, but as a colossal inconvenience, an obstacle to his ambition. His mind was already in London strategizing. He threw his briefcase on the bed and immediately called his primary contact for the London deal, a man named Jeffrey Price. "Jeffrey, it's Arthur," he said, his voice a carefully crafted performance of a weary survivor. "You won't believe what's happened. A catastrophic engine failure over the Atlantic. Complete terror for hours." The pilot nearly lost control. He was already twisting the narrative painting Vance as borderline incompetent to justify his earlier behavior should it ever come up. But look, the important thing is, I'm on the ground. They're arranging new flights. I should be in London by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. The deal is secure. We'll sign as planned. He was met with a chilling silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur," Jeffrey finally said, his voice flat and cold. "Have you been online in the last hour?" "What?" "No. I've been dealing with this airline mess." "Why?" "You need to," Jeffrey said, and the line went dead. A knot of confusion and unease began to form in Jensen's stomach. It was then that his phone connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi began to convulse. A tidal wave of notifications held back by the lack of an in-flight signal crashed upon him all at once. His screen lit up like a slot machine, a blur of text messages, missed calls, and a ceaseless cascade of email alerts. The sheer volume was staggering. Then he saw the text from his COO. It was a link to a major news outlet. He clicked it. The headline was a sledgehammer blow. CEO Arthur Jensen of Jensen Capital filmed in racist rant against hero pilot who later saved flight. Jensen's blood ran cold. He scrolled down. There it was, the video Chloe Martinez had filmed. The shaky footage made the scene feel raw and immediate. He saw his own face twisted with a contempt he didn't even recognize, his voice sharp and venomous. "I want a white pilot. I'm sure you have one. Find him." His words echoed in the quiet hotel room, alien and monstrous. The article was a tapestry of his own humiliation. It juxtaposed the vile video with glowing quotes from other passengers. "A true hero," one said of Vance. "The calmest man I've ever seen," said another. His own behavior was described as a shocking display of bigotry and the height of entitled arrogance. The digital avalanche intensified. His name was trending globally on formerly Twitter. Captain Vance was a celebration of heroism. Such racist passenger and Arthur Jensen were digital pillories where thousands of strangers were tearing his life and reputation to shreds. His company's Wikipedia page had already been edited to include a controversies section detailing the incident. The London deal was the first casualty. An official email, cold and formal, arrived from Jeffrey Price's firm. Mr. Jensen, in light of the video of your conduct which has come to our attention, we are terminating all negotiations with Jensen Capital, effective immediately. We will not do business with a company whose leadership embodies such reprehensible values. A press release announcing our decision is forthcoming. The 9-figure deal, the capstone of his career, had not just evaporated, it had become a tool for his own condemnation. Then came the clients. He saw an email from the head of the California Educators Pension Fund, one of their largest and most prestigious accounts. It was a single, brutal sentence. Consider our $1.2 billion mandate, with Jensen Capital terminated effective immediately per Section 7B of our agreement regarding acts of moral turpitude. The board of directors, a group of powerful men he had handpicked and controlled for years, summoned him via an urgent email to an emergency virtual meeting. Jensen joined the video call from the sad little desk in his hotel room. On his screen, the faces of the board members stared back at him, a gallery of cold fury and undisguised panic. These were men who had celebrated his ruthlessness, but they had no tolerance for a scandal that threatened their own fortunes. Arthur, the chairman, a man named Bill Peterson, began without preamble. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jensen tried to speak to muster the old bluster. Bill, it's being blown out of proportion. It was a stressful moment, a misunderstanding. This is just cancel culture. Don't you dare! Another board member, a woman named Helen Grant, snapped, her voice shaking with rage. I have spent the last 2 hours on the phone with terrified investors. Your stressful moment has, as of this call, triggered over $3 billion in withdrawal requests. The stock prices of our subsidiary companies have cratered. The Jensen Capital name, our name, is now synonymous with racism. You haven't just embarrassed us, Arthur. You have inflicted a catastrophic, perhaps mortal wound on this firm. The chairman cut back in. The board has held a vote in accordance with the company bylaws. We find that your actions constitute gross misconduct and have brought the firm into severe disrepute. Your employment with Jensen Capital is terminated effective immediately. Security is on their way to your office to collect your things. You are to have no further contact with any employee or client of this firm. He was fired, unceremoniously executed in a video call while stranded thousands of miles from his now former empire. The call ended. The screen went black, reflecting his own pale, stunned face. While Jensen's world imploded, Captain Marcus Vance was being shielded and celebrated. American Airlines' corporate communications team, recognizing they had a genuine hero on their hands, had arranged for him and his crew to stay in the best hotel in Gander. His union had released a statement condemning the abuse he had faced and lauding his professionalism. His wife and kids had been flown out to meet him. When he finally addressed the media from a quiet room flanked by supportive airline executives, he was the embodiment of dignity. My job is to ensure the safety of my passengers and crew, he stated, his voice calm and steady. That is my only focus in the air. Prejudice and ignorance have no place on an aircraft. The only things that matter in a crisis are training, discipline, and teamwork. I'm proud of my first officer and our incredible cabin crew. We worked together to bring everyone home safely. That's the only story that matters. The final, most exquisite turn of the screw for Arthur Jensen came the next day. He was sitting in the Gander Airport terminal, a pariah amongst the other passengers of Flight 100, who were waiting for their rescheduled flights. They looked at him not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached pity that was infinitely worse. He was no longer a threat. He was just a pathetic story they would one day tell their friends. As he waited for his new flight, a cramped middle seat in economy on a different airline, which his now suspended corporate credit card had been declined for his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. The headline read, "Hero pilot Captain Marcus Vance to be honored by the FAA with Superior Airmanship Award." The article featured a photo of Vance standing with his wife, his arm around his teenage son, all of them beaming with pride. He was a hero, a professional, a family man. Everything Arthur Jensen in his arrogance had assumed the man was not. Jensen stared at the photo, the complete and total inversion of his worldview crashing down on him. The man he had deemed inferior was being lauded for his excellence. The authority he had tried to strip away was now being nationally recognized. He, Arthur Jensen, who had built his life on the idea of a natural hierarchy with himself at the top, was now at the absolute bottom. He had lost his company, his reputation, his fortune, and the very foundation of his identity. He had demanded a different pilot, and in doing so, had piloted himself directly into the abyss. This story is a stark reminder that in a world that can often feel divided, there are arenas where only character and competence matter. The cockpit of an airplane, the operating room of a hospital, the heat of a crisis. These are places where prejudice is not only morally wrong, but a dangerous liability. Captain Marcus Vance showed the world that true authority isn't demanded. It's earned through discipline, skill, and grace under pressure. Arthur Jensen learned the hardest lesson of his life when you're falling from 35,000 feet. You don't look at the color of the hand reaching out to save you. What did you think of the karma Arthur Jensen received? Was it deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that professionalism and decency should always triumph over prejudice, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And for more incredible stories of justice and karma, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Thank you for listening.